Welcome to chapter 14, titled A Strategy. This chapter is in our Beyond Feelings book, which of course is our critical thinking book. So we have arrived at part 3 of this book. We've talked about the errors in argument. We've talked about how to argue properly. We've kind of investigated ourselves and worked on our own self-awareness in the beginning chapters of the book in part 1. So now that we are in part 3, we will be developing a strategy using all of the skills and tools we have learned so far to be quality critical thinkers. So now we've arrived at the point of the book where we kind of put it all together. But in order to do this successfully, we have to be willing to acknowledge any weaknesses that we have. We have to be able to shed our ego. And it's so important to shed our ego if we're going to be able to truly know ourselves. So what I would like for you to do for lecture activity 1 is to answer the 3 questions on the slide here. What is self-awareness? Why do we want to be self-aware? And how can we become more self-aware? And so we're kind of revisiting some of the ideas from the first part of the book when we talked about identity and about knowing ourselves. So some of these questions are review, of course, but it's important that you have a good understanding of the importance of knowing yourself and that you can kind of talk about that. So for lecture activity 1, just answer all 3 of those questions. I would say 3 sentences minimum per question. So you should by now have some pretty robust answers to those questions, hopefully. And after you complete that lecture activity, then go ahead and watch this clip on Eckhart Tolle and Oprah talking about finding your identity, knowing yourself, shedding your ego, becoming more self-aware, and why all of that is so important.
Let's start with an overview of what this chapter is really about. You say that it is about, you begin with know thyself. Chapter 7 starts with those 2 words that you say are inscribed above the entrance of a famous Greek temple. You say on page 186, what those words imply is this: before you ask any other questions, first ask the most fundamental question of your life: who am I? And then you say on page 189 that you are not the ego. So when you become aware of the ego in you, it doesn't mean you know who you are. It means you know who you're not.
When you realize who you are not, then suddenly who you are becomes revealed to you. And who you are cannot easily be put into words, because if it could, then it could be answered in one simple sentence, and then everybody could repeat that answer and believe that they know who they are.
That's right.
So we start with knowing who you are not, and that begins for people sometimes with loss, where they lose something valuable that they had identified with, or death comes into their lives, some kind of breakdown or disaster happens. Sometimes those people suddenly awaken. Something has been taken away from them that they had identified with for many years, that had become part of their sense of self. And if something very fundamental that has been part of your sense of self is removed, death, loss,
even
collapse,
if it's a person, a human being who you loved.
Yes, it could be somebody close to you who dies. Then, of course, at first it leads to enormous suffering, and you feel as if part of you had died also. And for some people that happens even if they lose possessions, because they were so identified with their possessions that when their possessions are removed, they feel there's nothing left of me. Another related to possessions is social position. If people fall from some high social position, there's a scandal, it happens all the time in the news.
Yes.
Not mentioning any names.
Yes, don't. You don't have to.
And then these people can be extremely painful if they had become totally identified with either their possessions or their social position, and they are suddenly faced with a kind of huge emptiness in their lives. And then the question arises, I'm nobody anymore. And this is the point, a decisive point is reached there, where they can either continue to resist and suffer, resist what has happened internally, complain about it, tell themselves story about it, how it's all collapsed, or they can suddenly come to a point of acceptance of what happened and acceptance of the present moment. So they suffered at first, and then suddenly an inner shift happened. They accept it.
Okay, so many people go through life not realizing their strengths, their weaknesses, their virtues, and their abilities. Some of what we know about ourselves we like, and some of what we know about ourselves we don't like. And so that can be one of the reasons that people don't really look inward and become introspective and really try to understand themselves, because it can be a very painful process. But even though it's painful, or can be, self-improvement requires that we pay attention to it all, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So if you really want to get to know yourself better and have a great depth of self-awareness so that you can truly be a critical thinker, the best way to embark on this journey is to just ask yourself questions about everything. So the questions that you should ask yourself, the book actually provides to you, and that's going to be what you're doing for application activity 6, is answering those questions. And it's so important that you do that comprehensively with a lot of detail, and even more importantly, that you shed your ego and you are very honest in your replies. And so your answers to these questions should include the good, the bad, and the ugly. None of us are perfect, and we need to know all of it to really understand ourselves. So you're going to kind of get to know yourself better in application activity 6. Okay, so to kind of get you motivated to do the application activity and to really be in a good space while you do it, I have this quote from Albert Ellis for you. Man can live the most self-fulfilling, creative, and emotionally satisfying life by intelligently organizing and disciplining his thoughts. But humans are prone to avoid focusing on and coping with their problems, and instead often sweep them under the rug by resorting to rationalization, denial, compensation, identification, projection, avoidance, repression, and other defensive maneuvers. So what Ellis is saying here is, if we know ourselves, we can really control our thoughts a lot better, and this can then improve the quality of our lives. But it's a lot of work to do this, and it's a lot of work to become a good critical thinker. So is the challenge worth the effort? I say absolutely yes. Being a good critical thinker will help you in every area of your life, in school and business and relationships, in your personal life, in your relationship with yourself. So hopefully you find that some motivation to complete the application activity 6 and answer those questions really well, really vulnerably, openly, honestly. Really take this opportunity to get to know yourself better. Okay, so that's it for this chapter. Submit your lecture activity and then go ahead and get started on application activity 6 and answering the questions from this chapter. Have a good day.